finance department doesn't necessarily want to meet with 20 different groups and hear 20 different things. So, and it's particularly important now with the climate and biodiversity crises that the budget make big investments in the kind of changes that we need. Briefly, the coalition is hosted by Nature Canada. It operates by consensus. We have roughly 4 caucuses, one around nature and biodiversity, climate change and energy, healthy communities, which touches on toxics and fresh water, infrastructure, Indigenous and First Nations communities, and sustainable agriculture. And this table, while really busy and not as beautiful as the one you saw a few minutes ago, kind of summarizes what the coalition does. Oops, you probably can see this. I'll get rid of that. See what the coalition does over the year. And we meet often days or a week after the federal budget and start coming up with our list of recommendations for the next year. So that's up in here. So our members start calling their government officials and checking in about the kind of recommendations we have in mind for next year and what kind of recommendations would work and what kind of numbers would be appropriate to be asking for. In April and May, we work pretty intensively and draft most of our recommendations, which is about a 100-page document with, depending how you define them, roughly 50 recommendations that cross climate change and nature, environmental justice, and a number of different issues. So then around June 1st, we produced the first version of our document called our preliminary recommendations document. We send it widely across government, and then we meet with the assistant deputy ministers of different departments. And the ones you might think of, like Environment Canada and Fisheries and Oceans and NRCan, but also and Infrastructure Canada, but also the economic departments like Innovation, Science and Economic Development. We meet with Finance. We meet with the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, CMHC. And at that point, we have 2 key priorities. And one is to give them an early heads up about what our priorities are, but the other is to hear their feedback on how we can strengthen our recommendations, to hear what their questions are, what the gaps are, what we're missing. And then we go back in the summer and revise our document based on what we heard in those meetings, and also translate it and beautify it and turn into a beautiful document, which you can see on our website. And we also talk with Indigenous allies at that time and hear their input and try to incorporate their priorities as well. So then in September, and really I'll just skip ahead here, in October, what you can see in blue here, and this year it's happening in November, it happens at different times, different years, is the finance minister sends a letter to all the line ministers saying, send me a letter telling me what your department wants in the budget. So our objective with this whole process is to meet with the minister or the minister's staff before they write that letter and ask them to copy and paste our recommendations into their letter to the minister. So in September, early October, we try to meet with the ministers and political staff and deputy ministers from the different departments and the Prime Minister's office to advocate for that. We also publicly release our recommendations document. After the letters have all gone to the finance minister, when it's a little more clear what the best opportunities are for the next budget, we meet with the finance minister, we meet with the deputy minister of finance, and we have certain key meetings with departments that keep happening over that time, which leads up to budget day, which, as you heard, is usually in February or March. And at that time, the different coalition members respond publicly on their own. So this is what the coalition looks like in practice. The photo at the top is from March 9th, 2020, days before the pandemic closed the world. We met with then Finance Minister Morneau, and you see a whole group of us together there. And we run pretty tight meetings using an hour or half an hour, however much time we have. And below you see, I think this is from February of this year when we met with the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrysler Freeland, and there's about 10 executive directors of Green Budget Coalition members in that meeting from groups like the David Suzuki Foundation, WWF, Canadian Wildlife Federation, ISD. So over time, we've heard a lot of very positive feedback on the coalition's work. We bring together the environmental community's priorities and expertise in one document in one meeting. It's effectively one-stop shopping for the government. But we also have a comprehensive, detailed, costed document. All our recommendations have specific dollar values, which a lot of stakeholders do not do. And it becomes a year-round resource that we hear that policy advisors keep it on their shelf and handy. And it's considered to be effective and constructive. And there's some quotes that we've heard from senior government officials that the coalition is the most effective advocacy group in Canada, that we uniquely speak the language of finance and government, and that we come together in a powerful way. And some of the lessons we've learned over the years, I think this first one's really important, is to, and I imagine some of you might find frustrating, but it's to frame recommendations in the context of what the current priorities are. And almost always in government, economic growth and jobs is a really key one. But also, like, so right now, affordability is a concern, inflation is a concern, benefits for Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership is a high priority. So the more that we can integrate those and frame our recommendations in those ways, the more likely they are to be adopted. Also, persistence. It can sometimes take years and years to get support for really good ideas. Government relationships in departments and ministers' offices, the Prime Minister's office, all over the place. Every relationship you build helps to strengthen our efforts. Prioritizing recommendations is key too, because whenever we have a meeting, they look at us and say, so, you have 50 recommendations, what do you really want? And so we try to prioritize 5 of them, and they're often general recommendations. So some of them have a number of parts, but that's part of our effort. And then we focus on, in our document, we feature those, and in our meetings with government, we feature those 5. It's really important to have complementary efforts from the individual environmental groups, from government officials, from MPs, from political staff, from the finance department, that they're all supporting a similar objective. And it's also really important to have support from the public too, which is what I hope all of you can help us with. And sometimes with funders where there's matching dollars being looked for protected areas, for example. And there's also a balance between focusing on the annual budget and being aware of some of the other opportunities during the year, like the fall economic statement has become a bigger opportunity now. And the actually, I think just today, I don't know if it's been announced yet or sometime in today, the National Adaptation Strategy is supposed to be announced. And we've been really hoping that there'll be money announced with it to make it much more effective. So that's something we've been talking about. And you're probably aware of the Nature COP happening in Montreal in December, and we're really hoping there'll be big announcements there. So those are all, so we focus on the budget, but also on other opportunities. And just to stop the first phase, this is just a high level sense of what our recommendations look like. There's the cover of our document for budget 2022. And the recommendations, the feature recommendations that year. And then
I'm just going to jump in, Andrew, and see if we can answer some of the questions here in the chat. Mildred said that forestry affects the fisheries. Has this connection been recognized in government?
I'll admit that's not my prime expertise. I sense that there's awareness of the impacts of forestry on fisheries within government, but I imagine probably not as much as you would like. That's why we continue to have impacts.
Thank you. Another question that we had is from Mike. What if there are necessary environmental recommendations that are not good for economic growth? Not good.
I mean, my sense is that each proposal for the budget gets considered through a number of criteria, and economic growth is really important and environmental protection is really important. So sometimes there will be environmental measures. I mean, carbon pricing is an example where in the short term, it's expected to have negative economic impacts, but over time, it's so fundamental to environmental progress that the government supports it. So you'll have, and the reverse is true. As someone sent in a question that was submitted, that often there's economic growth that is supported even when it has negative environmental impacts. So I think the decision makers weigh the different impacts, and there's social impacts, and there's rural economic growth, and there's Indigenous communities. So those pieces are all weighed, and also just political impacts.
Thank you. That's all in the chat for now.
Okay, great. Well, I will move on then. So questions people often ask us is, what are the impacts of the coalition? So In budget 2022 and also the emissions reduction plan, which was announced days before, there was over $6 billion announced supporting the coalition's objectives and our recommendations, including over $1 billion for building energy efficiency, nearly $900 million for clean electricity, over $2 billion for zero emission vehicle incentives and funding for nature-based solutions, freshwater, agriculture. So there's major announcements being made. At the same time, we do not in any way pretend to be the only reason why these announcements are being made. I think it's as increasing organizations and individuals advocate on climate change, these announcements are the result of our collective efforts. But certainly we do feel like we played a substantial influential role, and the government acknowledges that and often gives the coalition a special briefing after or during the budget announcement because of the role that we play in consulting with them. So you're probably wondering about this coming year. So for budget 2023, which we started working on in April of this year, or really before that, here's some of the key context that we see. We have a minority government, which was mentioned earlier, with stability. So it's almost operating like a majority government. But there's also on our minds and many people's minds that it's very possible that in 2025, whenever the next election is, that the government may change and we may have a government that's less committed to environmental progress, which may mean some of the things that have been done may get rolled back, or there may be much less openness to progress. We have historic government deficits and there's real austerity pressures. And you saw Chrystia Freeland in her letter to ministers asked them to find 25% of the money for any of their new announcements or any of the new money that they were asking for. She asked them to find that in reallocated funds from their departments. And then clearly the Ukraine is having a major impact where there's great pressures for increasing production of energy, even if it's fossil fuels across Europe and here too. You're hearing about inflation a lot. Affordability concerns are paramount. Governments are always concerned about where their poll ratings are going up, and I think so they need to be seen to be addressing affordability. And you're seeing some provincial governments roll back fuel taxes for that reason. At the same time, we have a unique opportunity in time with a government that's highly committed to major climate and nature objectives, and more than any government I've seen in my 15 years with the coalition, and probably more than at any time. And as you know, that also matches the scale of the problem environmentally, and climate and nature is greater than it's ever been. And we've seen major funding announced over the last 2 years in budgets and fall economic statements. So there's a lot of money out there, there's momentum. And there's also part of what that means is the finance department is saying, well, you haven't spent all the money that we've announced yet. Why would we give you more already? So there's tensions around that. And so how do we respond to that? So here's some of our strategy. I mean, in part, we're following our usual process of drafting preliminary recommendations and meeting with government officials, maintaining those relationships and ongoing discussions. We're emphasizing the importance of large-scale multi-year funding. For example, on zero emissions electricity, we're asking for roughly $20 billion over 5 years, and yet framing that as a down payment. On protected areas, we're asking for roughly, I think it's $18 billion over 7 years. Again, sort of unprecedented numbers that we've never asked for before. We're also emphasizing the importance of integrating climate and biodiversity progress, because these issues are both important, and we'll all be better off if climate and biodiversity funding integrates the other in its efforts. And along the way, equity considerations, environmental justice, Indigenous well-being and leadership are all integrated into many of our recommendations as much as possible, similarly, because we want to advance all these considerations together. And our document is a mix of continued promotion of recommendations that we've had for many years, such as clean electricity and building energy efficiency and protected areas, and many of our recommendations we continue to push on. And on the other hand, we have a number of new ones, including one for a municipal climate action fund, which is particularly unique this year. So we just continue to work on a multi-year process of building support. this is what our document looks like this year. I hope the cover helps to communicate the critical situation we are in around climate and nature. So again, we have 5 recommendations we're featuring this year around zero emissions electricity, the renovation wave, land and ocean protection, sustainable agriculture, environmental justice. And then through those, as mentioned, integrate Indigenous concerns and equity. And then there's roughly another 40 other recommendations in our document, including fossil fuel subsidies, transportation, just transition, nature-based solutions, oceans, freshwater, restoration. And when we meet with different departments, we promote the recommendations of most relevance to them. And with Environment Canada, that could be 30, but with DFO, there's maybe 10 that relate to them. When we meet with Infrastructure Canada, there's a different list. So it depends on the department we're meeting with. And I'll just give you a quick glimpse of some of the different issues that we address. So on climate change and emissions reduction, we're featuring zero emissions electricity in buildings and retrofits, but we also have recommendations on climate lens, on green strings, which is a key piece because, as mentioned, there's been billions of dollars announced, especially for innovation. And what we're trying to make sure is that the criteria, the conditions that are put on these funds include stringent climate and biodiversity concerns, so that the innovation funds help to drive the progress we need and don't lead us backwards to more of a grayer economy. And we continue to push on electric vehicles, marine shipping, some of the others I mentioned, international climate finance. We're really hoping for announcements on international biodiversity at the COP in December, and nature-based solutions. And on nature conservation, we have a recommendation on land and ocean protection. It has 4 aspects to it, and part of it is Indigenous-led conservation. And now our recommendations around where there's Indigenous leadership aspects are quite unique because those are exceptions where we don't actually have specific dollar values. And what our recommendations say is that we support what the Indigenous organizations and communities are asking for, or as they develop those asks. But permanent funding is a key piece that we're asking for, because governments have often announced new protected areas, but to actually have a protected area that's functional, you need to announce funding on an ongoing basis for the management and maintenance of those protected areas, both the physical infrastructure and the natural biodiversity protection. And that's why we're asking. So we're asking for, I think it's roughly $1.4 billion a year, ramping up to $2.8 billion a year there. And there's also a role in the South for privately protected areas that are an important piece. And then connectivity between the protected areas. And we're hoping to get some funding for NGOs to help drive further progress on the whole protected area agenda. We have recommendations around restoration, which often relate more to private lands, which are less the government lands, and blue carbon. Natural infrastructure is a key area, and this is an area where, 10 years ago, natural infrastructure was, I think, kind of seen as a kind of esoteric idea that the infrastructure department was pretty unlikely to fund. And I think over years of promoting it, the coalition played a big role in shifting things, where now you see billion-dollar announcements for natural infrastructure, and governments across the country are increasingly considering natural infrastructure options. And we have recommendations around freshwater and fish habitat, oceans, migratory birds. Migratory birds have been a big challenge for a lot of years. There just isn't a lot of public pressure on the federal government for it, even as there are concerned naturalists all across the country. And wildlife health, which ties into COVID and disease spreading. And we're also starting to push on subsidies that are counterproductive for biodiversity in parallel with fossil fuel subsidies, because some of the government's funding, tied into one of the questions we received, works effectively to support actions that are counterproductive to preserving biodiversity. And another broad areas around equity, environmental justice, and Indigenous well-being. And so we have a recommendation around building institutional capacity to ensure environmental justice. And two of our key recommendations there are to create an Office of Environmental Justice that would try to ensure that all programs across Canada included environmental justice priorities and concerns in the programs. And both of these asks are inspired by a program called, or a legislation called Justice 40 in the United States, and where about 40% of any funding for clean energy in the US needs to go to support disadvantaged communities. And so what we're asking for in Canada is for the government to take a look at that idea and develop its own number of what percentage would be an appropriate number in Canada. Because we do have better support programs, social support programs in Canada, but we're asking for a similar baseline in Canada for all clean energy programs. And some of the other ways that we incorporate Indigenous priorities in our recommendations for clean electricity, we have an ask for a few $100 million for Indigenous nations, also asks for low income and vulnerable communities. And we met with the group called Indigenous Clean Energy, and in the process of developing our recommendations and include their ask in our renovation wave building energy efficiency recommendation. I mentioned the protected areas piece. Under fresh water, we have another recommendation for capacity to engage Indigenous peoples in the development of freshwater policy. So, and then I think, imagine a key question that you're all wondering about is how can you help drive progress in the federal budget? So in part, the way, admittedly, the Green Budget Coalition's biggest weakness and area for opportunity is pressure on the federal government. We provide prime recommendations, well detailed, we meet with the right people. But at the end of the day, the government has very little risk if they don't implement our recommendations. I mean, aside from environmental problems. But if they're hearing from a lot of Canadians, emails and from across the country, that makes a real difference. And I think we've helped, some of our organizations have helped coordinate up to 40,000 letters to the finance minister in a year. So it would be really helpful for us if you just write to your MP, write to the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister and support our recommendations. And also to the relevant ministers and to your local MPs. And so I'm going to admit I'm less knowledgeable about the grassroots involvement on lobbying MPs. And I hope we'll have some time before the end of this hour that I can turn it over to you and hear some of your advice and experience in terms of those kind of opportunities. But I also want to say that like the Green Budget Coalition is focused narrowly on the federal budget, but to succeed at what we're recommending, the provincial and municipal governments are really important. And so to the extent that you as individuals and with your organizations can lobby your provincial and municipal government, that's really important. And like one example is natural infrastructure. We often hear from the federal government that they've allocated funds for natural infrastructure, but the provinces and the municipalities aren't asking for it. Or where they have the option of asking for natural infrastructure funding, instead, they're only asking for gray infrastructure. So somebody needs to be pushing your provinces and the municipalities to think about natural infrastructure and ask for federal funding for it. For protected areas, often the areas that need to be protected are provincial government or they have provincial jurisdiction. And so having provincial support and commitment is really important for progress on meeting Canada's protected area goals. Otherwise, it will be just about impossible. We similarly hear on agriculture funds, the government's funding on agriculture, a lot of it goes through something that's now called the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Policy and Partnership, sorry. And they're increasing the climate motivation in it, but the provinces need effectively have a lot of control over how they implement those funds. And so they need pressure from their own constituents to drive more in climate priorities within agricultural policies. And again, on retrofits and on clean energy, electric vehicle infrastructure, rebates. I mean, all these certainly see in Ontario, the provinces have a major role to play in in implementing parallel programs like EV rebates and solar panel incentives and their own support programs for building retrofits. And again, carbon pricing is an area where provinces can be really supportive or resistant. And so then there were a number of questions that were submitted. So I'd like to just start responding to some of them here. I heard a question about how do you evaluate the scale of budget announcements? And that's a really good question. I mean, I think in the context of where we're at climate change and nature biodiversity loss, there's almost no amount of money that overall is enough. But I think looking at our recommendations is a really good guide for whether the government lived up to what we were asking for. And in drafting our recommendations, we consult with government officials to get a sense of like what is practical. And there are practical limitations to what we can do on solar panels and on building retrofits in the short term, because there's only so many workers in Canada, and that's a very live discussion in government, is how do we educate and train enough staff to be able to work on building retrofits and clean energy. And the question of impacts and where the money goes is another really good question. And the coalition doesn't really track that. In the end, we mostly track it to the point of, did they announce funding relevant to the amount of money we asked for? But certainly if we had enough capacity, ideally we'd be also tracking what the results are. I mean, I do think, from having discussed this issue with countries in the South, that you have much more faith that the money that gets announced actually does go to the issues that it should go to, and that well-meaning people are working to make it work. But it's hard to track specific impacts. The Commissioner on the Environment and Sustainable Development will be doing more and more audits on the impacts of those climate programs. So I would in part look to the Commissioner's reports and contact the Commissioner about issues that you'd like them to audit on. I mean, I talked a little bit earlier about environmental impacts versus economic and job benefits. I mean, every program that gets announced has a mix of impacts, and we need to keep pushing for the environmental benefits to be a high priority. But jobs are really important too. I mean, they're important for lots of reasons, and partly just politically, that if people are maintaining their employment, they're much more likely to support the government. And if people are losing their jobs, they're much less likely to support whatever the government's doing. There was a question about whether the finance department considers ecosystem services. I would say, I don't think it's a high priority. I imagine the departments, when they send requests for funding to finance, they provide the best pitch that they can. And to the extent that there's a rationale for ecosystem services, such as planting trees or wetlands for natural infrastructure, they would certainly use those arguments as part of their rationale. There was a question about Export Development Canada and oil and gas support. And we have a big recommendation around fossil fuel subsidies. And one of our recommendations is around public finance and getting Export EDC to stop supporting oil and gas projects. So we are working on that. And the issue of integrating Indigenous-led and land-back approaches into the budget. I don't know that this is driven by the finance department, but I do certainly hear that across government, like the other departments are considering Indigenous priorities frequently. And so I think the asks that come from the departments will often include Indigenous concerns. Like our recommendations trying to have Indigenous leadership and developing what the programs look like and making sure that there are benefits to Indigenous communities. I don't know that the land back approach would be, I'm not aware of it making its way into budget priorities yet. There was a question about circular economy, and this kind of is on the, I would say, is on the fringe of what the Green Budget Coalition works on, because we try to focus on things that go into the budget. And circular economy measures are what I would consider economic policy, and they aren't necessarily included in budgets, but they are driven by finance and they are very important. And there are increasing discussions now around industrial policy, which ties really closely to the circular economy. So within the coalition, we're thinking more and more about including recommendations around industrial policy and around circular economy in our recommendations for the budget 2024. Like literally a few days ago, I was having a discussion with a colleague about this. Then there were some questions around putting pressure on government, and this is something that I think about a lot. It's not really my expertise. I focus on, the budget and the internal game effectively, but I would say broadly that anything you can do, calling your MP, the finance department, the prime minister, emails, demonstrations, talking about it with your friends and your family and people who don't necessarily want to talk about climate change, organizing, supporting efforts that are out there, or organizing your own, working on issues that matter to you, and trying to do so in a way that nourishes you so you continue to do it, because we're not going to solve climate change overnight, obviously. So the more that you can enjoy it or feel nourished, the better. And yeah, so work with others, join. There's lots of efforts out there. See if you can find something going on that you can support, or talk to your friends and come up with something you can all do together. I heard a proposal for a Ministry of Climate Information for sort of educating Canadians, and I'll say I really like this idea, and maybe I wonder if there could be like a youth group that could push the GBC to ask for this. I think there's a real reluctance in government to tell people what to do and what to think about, and particularly I would say maybe the 40% of Canadians who are more likely to vote Conservative, and especially after COVID, I think there's a much heightened resistance. And so I imagine government is just really reluctant to come across as telling Canadians what to think, that they're worried their poll numbers would start to drop. So I'd love to see a way to inspire more Canadians to care about climate change and take more action. And I don't sense the willingness within government to do that. Maybe if there was a majority government, maybe. And I'm just going to touch here on a few other topics that people mentioned around the difference from municipal budgets. I mean, municipal government has very different issues that they're responsible for, and they can look after planning. Planning is a big issue in municipalities. It's really important that the federal government and zoning and bike paths and roads, and whether they expand the roads or whether they build better transit and better bike lanes. Stopping Ontario from destroying natural habitat, I don't know that the federal government is going to do much about that, unfortunately. I think that's up to the rest of us in Ontario. And there was a question about Green Canada for Sustainable Generation, and I must admit I didn't really understand what that was about. But I welcome if somebody wanted to add details on that. So that is a lot, I guess. That's my presentation. I'm open to questions. I'm also really open if from those of you who've been working on budgets in the past and have ideas and thoughts and experiences to share. I'd sort of welcome you being prompted to share those with the group.
We actually have some questions in the chat, and I think someone had a hand up. Myron, I think you had a hand up, so you can unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. I have several concerns. I have concerns about the methane from the thawing tundra in the far north and the methane being given off by oil rigs. And I have concerns if we don't deal with that methane, it's going to last 50 years and it's going to be a big problem. It's not as problematic as the COE, the carbon dioxide, but I believe there's going to be methane given off from the thawing tundra of the far north. So what to do about that? Indigenous partnerships, you talked about a little bit, but dealing with more with Indigenous partnerships, and also biodiversity, animal and plants. Like we're going to lose our polar bears probably. And how do we deal with that? And search and rescue if we have a large area, and I'd hate for us to be I'd hate for it to be a bombing zone of shooting down missiles from the United States, from Russia or something. And defense of our country, but also I believe defense could be a search and rescue operation. I believe they could work together. And the final one is electricity is not really zero emission, in my opinion. I don't think electricity is zero emission. We have a lot of nuclear waste to get rid of if we go nuclear. If we go hydro, we're bowling over valleys of the sea. Anyways, that's my 5 concerns. But my major concern is how do we cope with the methane that's going to be given off from our thawing tundra in the far north and the tundra that's being given off by our oil rigs?
Thank you for those questions. I appreciate your interest. Firstly, I do want to mention that in one hand, as much as the coalition, I think, does amazing work on a lot of different issues, we also, part of what keeps the coalition together is we operate within the box, which is federal budget measures. And there's lots of things that would be better addressed by regulatory measures, policy changes, or by provincial and municipal governments. And on methane, I'm not an expert on that. I think that Enercan is working on proposals to try to dramatically reduce methane from oil rigs, but I don't honestly know. I can't speak to the issue of methane from tundra. I'm sorry to say. Indigenous partnerships, we strongly support them in our document, and particularly around protected areas, and also clean energy projects are 2 prime opportunities there. The biodiversity commitments that the government's made are key, sort of by like protecting 30% of our lands and oceans by our lands and waters by 2030 is a key driver in our document, and through recommendations for protected areas and restoration in particular, and oceans. I don't know. I must admit, I don't know anything really about search and rescue, so I can't speak to that. And I will say on electricity, we're not saying that our current electricity supplies are zero emission. What we're pushing for is to move to a point where as much or 100% of our supplies are zero emissions. And we're also aiming to end subsidies to small modular reactors and nuclear power. And that's a real debate. I think it's a real tension point because there's certainly government support for them too. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. I personally would like to see a 4th transportation corridor built just below the tree line. We have a Canadian Shield, which is granite, which isn't going to sink into the soil like our tundra is, and like in the Soviet Union, it doesn't have a Soviet Union. It doesn't have a Canadian. It doesn't have a shield of granite, and so their land is going to sink into the. Anyways, I'm taking up too much time.
Thank you, Myron. I'm just going to go to some questions in the chat, and then I'll circle back to Stephen's hand there. We have a question from Benjamin. Could you talk a bit more about the decision-making processes for which recommendations get prioritized?
Sure, I will say it's not a stringent process. It's a very, I mean, as we often wait until after our first round of meetings with government, and you hear in meetings with government that they ask questions about certain things and they don't ask questions about other things. But we have 3 main criteria. One is environmental benefit. One is political opportunity. And the third is outside support. And so, I mean, environmental benefit probably is relatively, I mean, it's hard to compare, but it makes some sense to you. But in terms of political opportunity, if the government's made a commitment in its platform, in its mandate letters to ministers, if it's making public commitments such as protecting 30% of protected areas by 2030, I mean, the government's clearly moving ahead on zero emissions electricity or on electricity in general. So that's a prime opportunity. And they're trying to reduce emissions from buildings. So that's a prime opportunity. And protected areas the Prime Minister talks about. So those are all prime opportunities. In agriculture, there's a 5-year cycle of funding where it gets renewed. And this was the year where those decisions are being made. So that's a key reason why we're featuring that. So those, at a high level, those are the considerations we have. And we don't have like a point structure. We just discuss them, and it often sort of becomes relatively evident to us where the prime opportunities are and where how we can best use our social capital to advance environmental sustainability in that year.
Cool. Thank you for your answer. I also had a follow-up question on what you were talking about earlier about how the government decides and evaluating like budget amounts. Could you talk a bit on how they decide and how they figure out how much a given initiative will cost? Because some things cost, $1 million, and then sometimes an initiative goes up to $1 billion. So could you talk on how it is determined how much something will cost?
I've often heard said that budgets are like hot dogs. You don't want to know how they're made. They imagine that, I mean, I'm from the outside, I sense that in part the relevant department comes up with an estimate of what it costs. And some programs are scalable, and often finance would like you to send sort of like a version A, version B, version C of different scales, which I imagine you could do with sort of building retrofits or rebate or ZEV rebates of how many cars you want to fund. So the department does the research into what the cost is, and then they send that to the finance department. And then I imagine often the finance department pushes back and says, this seems like too much. Can you reduce it? Can you scale it down? So at a high level, I think that's kind of where the numbers go. And sometimes they're looking to spend more and scale it up. And so there's a whole discussion between finance and the Prime Minister's office and the relevant department, and sometimes other MPs, I think, that happens.
Cool, thank you. And for those of us who do want to see how the hot dog gets made, do you have any places to look that like resources you'd recommend on learning more about that?
Someone sent me a video I haven't had a chance to look at, but that I imagine could be helpful. If you email me after, I could try to dig that up and send it to you.
Sure, thank you.
Okay.
We'll go to Stephen.
Hi, I've got a couple of sort of like comment questions. I'm not sure how much they fit into what your purview is, but they both are kind of based on Seth Klein's book, A Good War. The first one being that I was involved in an action with 350.org called the Ministry of Just Transition, and I don't know if you're aware of that. It doesn't necessarily fit right in with a budget proposal, but it's the idea that we establish a ministry of just transition. One of the things that's important about this is that we have to get labor on side with the environment. And right now, although we talk of a just transition, there really is no avenue. And I think you brought that up about people losing their jobs. There should not be that necessity. We should be able to through natural attrition, whenever people are retiring, we should be able to be creating jobs and training people to go into the green economy. The other thing that's related to this is in his book, although he doesn't name it, is modern monetary theory. And because one of the things we'll be up against is this idea of we have to cut back too much government spending. There's a very good book by Stephanie, and I forget her last name, called The Deficit Myth. If you have a sovereign currency, your budget is not dependent just on taxation. And so I just wonder about this as making as something to use to make the argument that these are things that we have to do. We have to be investing in these things that are actually creating value in our country. So I'm not sure whether those are exactly questions, but if you could respond in a way to to those comments.
Sure. Those are thoughtful ideas. I mean, on the first one, we do have recommendations around just transition, and they're there because we do feel it's really important, and they're not, even though they're not actually budget asks, but they are an important complement. Interestingly, people in Alberta, and I think even some of the labor community, don't like the term just transition, so it's not popular within government because people don't necessarily like to think of themselves as being that person. But a key person, but the government is really looking at a broader framing of how do we create an economy that has good jobs for everybody, including, and a lot of people who are part of the old economy have skills that can be transitioned to be part of the clean energy projects and renovations. So there is a lot of attention to that within government. And in terms of monetary policy, I'm not an expert on that. I've heard people who deeply believe in certain views, and I also have a lot of the people at finance department seem to me like it's very smart, and the fact that they haven't bought into it yet makes me uncertain. So that's the short answer there. Tiana, since we're running out of time.
Yes, we are. So I'm just going to take one more question from the chat here. A question from Cody. Given we have a minority government, how much effort does this GBC invest in educating and influencing the opposition parties? Do you try to turn them into advocates for your budget recommendations?
It's a good, important question. We do meet with all the opposition parties. And I will admit that we spend most of our time talking to the government, not necessarily government MPs, but all the different departments that I sense will be making the decisions. We certainly met with the NDP, and we met with, I mentioned the Conservative critic. But I do sense it's the Liberal government that's making most of the decisions right now in consultation with the NDP. I do think, though, if you look farther ahead, it's really important to bring the Conservative Party on board to be supportive of environmental priorities, climate change, and biodiversity loss, because it's very possible that they will be in government in a few years. And now is the time to build those relationships and build that support within that party.
That one was quicker than I thought. We can just do a quick wrap up. If you wanted to have any last thoughts, Andrew, what's the time?
Oh, I'll just say, I mean, thank you to everybody for your interest in joining this call and your interest in the budget. And certainly you can read our recommendations at greenbudget.ca. And there's, we have a new website now, so it's pretty easy to find whichever recommendation is of most interest to you. And please contact the government in support of them.
Amazing, thank you. Romy, if you wanted to just put up the last slide of our slide there.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just having technical difficulties.
No worries. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'll start the wrap up anyways. So thank you all for tuning in, and we hope that this was beneficial to everyone. And thank you to Andrew for doing this presentation on the federal budget. Hopefully there was some tips that you can learn to use this for your environmental advocacy. Coming up, we do have some things that you should stay tuned for. If you're not already signed up to our EDA list, then you should definitely do that. We plan on holding an event when the budget comes out, just to do a debrief. So if you want to have more information on that, then sign up. And yeah, thank you. We will have a feedback survey coming out as well. Sarah, if you wanted to jump in or add anything, that'd be perfect.
Sure. Yeah. So as Tiana, well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. And as Andrew said, it would be terrific if everybody engaged in the budget. Advocacy does matter, and Andrew and the group at the Green Budget Coalition have given us some great ideas that we can help to put our voices behind. In the survey that we're going to send, we're going to ask you for your input on how GreenPAC can provide workshops like these, or trainings or resources on other topics that would help to support your advocacy work. And we'd love to get your ideas. So stay tuned for that. And with that, we'll wrap up and thank everybody for coming today. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Tiana. And thanks, Anna. And thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Take care.